Friends, hello everyone. My name is Ihor Havryshchak. YouTube platform 24 channels. Thursday, June 19th evening in Ukraine. And that means that we traditionally have with us our guest from the United States of America, political scientist and former chief of staff of the government of Azerbaijan, Ramiz Yunus. Yunus, hello. Hello, thank you. Good to see you in good health. Greetings to all our audience. Glory to Ukraine. Glory to heroes. Yunus, here is President Donald Trump of the United States of America, advising Putin to first mediate Russia's war in Ukraine before sticking his nose into the Middle East. After that, Putin had a phone conversation with Xi Jinping, and they too, for some reason, decided to gauge for themselves how the G7 summit in Canada went. Finally, just tonight, literally, Vladimir Zelenskyy, the president of Ukraine, said that he very much hopes the war in Ukraine will end before the end of Donald Trump's term, January 20th, 2029. I'll start with that last one. How do you take Vladimir Zelenskyy's words, and can it be taken as him, well, not tweaking, but explaining to Trump that we've been disappointed and he's not acting on the pressure on Blitzer? You know, it doesn't matter here where we start the answer to your question from. Yes. Because you have now taken all the important news stories from your point of view and presented them in one package to analyze, and if we start over as you suggested, we will still come to the same thing because they are interconnected. Why? Because they focus on Donald Trump. He has become a factor that everybody recognizes today. You can treat him in different ways, bad, good, or neutral. It is a factor. For some, he is a plus, for others, a minus. For others, he is neutral. For me, he is neutral if we talk from the position of everyday life in the United States. For me, both Biden and Trump do not affect my life. I have arranged it individually. But if we talk about geopolitics, it definitely works to the advantage for some people, especially for those who are involved in the process. And for others, it works to the disadvantage. Let's look at where Ukraine is today with President Zelenskyy, where Europe is, where Russia is, where China is, and not only through the prism of the Russia-Ukraine issue, but also through the prism of events between Israel and Iran, and in the context of the upcoming NATO summit and the recent G7 summit. These are all interrelated events. When viewed holistically, everyone will get their own answer to one or another question that has been voiced, and perhaps to those that have not yet been asked. In the process of answering, I myself will identify these questions and try to answer them. Now, in order, what about the phone conversation between the Russian president and President Putin, and the fact that Donald Trump advised the Russian president to focus primarily on the Russian-Ukrainian issue and not to interfere in the Middle East? He said it in a more delicate way. I'm explaining it in a simpler way. I am sure he would say the same thing to Xi Jinping and will say it if he speaks out on the subject. He will also say it to the Europeans, so that no one is offended, neither Russia nor China. He is ready to voice this position to anyone. This topic is a priority for him now, and he is leading this party together with Benjamin Netanyahu. They have been preparing for this for a long time, and it seems to me that Donald Trump wants to be the sole beneficiary of this topic, as he suffered a serious fiasco in the issue of Russian-Ukrainian relations. He was unable to realize what he had planned. I have already talked about this in detail earlier, so I will now remind you thesis-wise. He failed to achieve peace through a show of force, and in the months that he was in power, in the context of the situation between Hamas and Israel after the events of October 7th, he did not achieve the expected result. As I said earlier, he will most likely try to demonstrate peace through strength on Iran, since Iran is now left alone with the might of the United States and the striking force of Israel. Neither Russia nor China, despite the fact that they are often lumped together with North Korea and Iran in the so-called axis of evil, have voiced support for Tehran. No country in the Muslim world is standing up for Iran, nor are other nations. International institutions are not effective, so there is no point in discussing them. Let's remember the situation after Syria. The same thing happened then, and there were similar conversations between the Russian president and Xi Jinping about the events in Syria. The same concerns were expressed and certain forms of engagement were suggested to create the illusion of diplomatic activity in an unfavorable environment. And then the Turkish president was curtsying toward Russia, calling the Russian president one of the two key world leaders, if you remember. This was after Russia, along with Iran, was forced out of Syria with great political damage. Now a similar situation is unfolding. This is a fiasco not only for Russia in the context of Iran, but also for China. The United States will not allow either Russia or China to participate in these processes. It is logical that these two countries will consult with each other and create an information backdrop to try to influence perceptions. However, nothing changes from the fact that they call each other and discuss the topic. What leverage do they have? Practically none. They don't fit into this situation. A concrete war is unfolding now, and the fate of Iran, the Iranian regime, will be determined by Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu. Judging by the development of events, there are few options left for Tehran. The toughest option is to dismantle the regime, and events may develop according to this scenario. The second option is also possible. Today, at a press conference at the White House, speaking to athletes, he directly stated that he did not rule out such an outcome. When it came to a possible meeting, apparently referring to Witkov's communication with Araksheev, the foreign minister, he replied, as if it were too late, "You don't rule out a change of regime." I don't rule out anything, including regime change. Such a turnaround could be realized through hardball methods or through influencing political elites. Perhaps that is why the presidential apparatus and the president personally have not been struck so far. At the same time, radicals who have held power for 46 years under the leadership of the spiritual leader are being deliberately eliminated. We are talking about the IRGC and related structures, including those who carried out repression inside the country and financed Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and Syria. And we are not just talking about those directly involved in the nuclear program, including nuclear scientists. There will be no half-hearted decisions. What decision will be made will become clear in the near future. Israel, together with the United States, now has a unique opportunity to deal with Iran that has not been seen in the 46 years of the current regime's existence. All major obstacles have been removed. Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis have been eliminated, and the airspace between Syria and Iraq is free. Iran is in the palm of its hand. Various scenarios are possible, including the use of heavy depth bombs on the Fordo nuclear complex or a pinpoint amphibious operation. An amphibious operation in the current environment could be much more successful than before, given Iran's current situation and the escalating strikes. If such a military operation is necessary, it is important that there is no risk of radiation leakage if conventional strikes are not precise enough. I think that issue is already being considered in the Situation Room. At the time of our conversation, I understand Donald Trump is holding a National Security Council meeting to discuss possible scenarios. A lot of things will become clearer in the near future. but it is already safe to say that this will be an extremely difficult situation for Iran, and no compromise solutions are expected. Both Beijing and Moscow realize this.
Так что в ближайшее время мы увидим появится много ясности, но могу точно сказать, что в этой тематике Иран не поздоровается, и, как повторюсь, половинчатых решений не будет. И это понимают и в Пекине, это понимают и в России.
This is a fiasco for both Beijing and Russia, as has already happened in the context of Syria. Returning to the final part of your question regarding President Zelensky's statement, it is first worth mentioning the G7 summit, where both Zelensky and Donald Trump were present. Trump appeared at the event, drawing attention from Macron and Melonier, who signaled clear approval. A conversation between her and Trump likely included important information. Overall, G7 leaders were satisfied with the meeting's outcome. Zelensky also expressed contentment, as no public decisions were expected. For him, this topic remains a top priority.
Президент Зеленский также остался доволен, потому что никаких там решений, как таковых для публичной этой самой, не готовилось и не собиралось.
Donald Trump's return has sparked discussion, particularly because he did not have a separate meeting with President Zelensky, as indeed he did with many other leaders, as he was actually returning to the Situation Room, where decisions had to be made. This is a moment in which he can fully rehabilitate himself and strengthen his position, both with China and Russia, as well as on the world stage and within the United States. The Iranian nuclear issue has been on the agenda for a long time, for decades, and all this time it has been postponed. There were treaties made by the Europeans, particularly under Obama, which Trump has always spoken out against. He has repeatedly said what he has been saying for 20 years: Iran should not have nuclear weapons. But so far, no one has made a final decision, and he doesn't want any more half solutions. He wants to put an end to this issue once and for all. And if he succeeds, and judging by the demonstrated determination, both on his part and on the part of Israel led by Benjamin Netanyahu, it is obvious that a clear and tough goal has been set. It is about ending this issue once and for all, after which Donald Trump will, of course, start to push harder for the implementation of the Abrahamic Agreement that he started in his first cadence. At the time, he called it his greatest foreign policy achievement, and so logically, he will seek to strengthen it. That means involving more countries. In particular, Trump seeks to include the South Caucasus states, including Azerbaijan. It is no coincidence that Witkoff secretly visited Baku. The visit lasted only 7 hours. In general, the U.S. plans to involve many countries in the initiative. The essence of the agreement is peaceful coexistence of representatives of Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The name was not chosen by chance because Abraham is considered the forefather of these three religions. If this is indeed the case, it is worth rethinking the situation in the Middle East from a clean slate. In this context, Iran stands as a separate destructive element, causing problems for everyone from the US and Israel to the Sunni Arab monarchies, and in fact hindering even those countries that either condemn Israel or express concern about the war between Israel and Iran. In 46 years, Iran has managed to ruin relations with the entire world and now has no full diplomatic ties with any country. This is not only about the EU and NATO countries, but even those who are in opposition to them. For example, China and Russia, despite their confrontation with the West, do not fit into this context either. Moreover, each of these countries has its own problems and grievances with Iran.
И вокруг, как вы видите, да, поэтому посмотрите, даже те страны, которые в конфронтации находятся с Евросоюзом, с НАТО, они также не вписываются, в первую очередь тот же Китай и та же Россия. Поэтому, тем более, у каждой из них свои проблемы, у них у каждой из них свои, так сказать, претензии к тому же Ирану, да,
Note who improved relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia. China did. Although relations have formally improved, this does not mean that they have become close allies. Nevertheless, there is no tangible benefit from this for either China or the other parties. As for Russia, after the Yanteli 17 agreement between Russia and Iran, the document explicitly states that Russia will not interfere in Iran's defense. Therefore, it should not be surprising that Russia is not taking action. It cannot do anything. Relations between Iran and Russia are rather cool today, despite their apparent closeness. It is wrong to think that they are in harmony. In fact, this partnership is forced, a kind of friendship by misfortune in the current context. Russia's weakening on Syria and Iran clearly strengthens the position of Ukraine and the European Union, which is both a strategic and geographic ally. Given the current stance of the Trump administration, EU support is becoming more and more tangible. At the G7 summit, Donald Trump essentially delegated Ukraine-related issues to the EU. This is exactly what was discussed at the meeting. He said that he would deal with another issue and return to the Ukrainian agenda later, already with more confidence. Perhaps this is why President Zelenskyy, as well as Macron, Melonier, the Canadian Prime Minister, and Merz perceive the Trump factor as key. They have to reckon with it, avoiding direct confrontation. The closest to him in terms of ideological positions is Giorgia Meloni, but even among the G7 countries, she is rather an exception dictated by geography. The other leaders, including the Canadian Prime Minister, the German Chancellor, and the French President, largely disagree with him. This is also evident in the difference in approaches to supporting Ukraine, especially given Italy's proximity to the region. The positions on Ukraine of the leading European states, Britain, Germany, France, Italy, are becoming more and more stable and active. President Zelensky's gesture of politeness to Donald Trump shows a desire to avoid confrontation and public tension. Everyone is trying to emphasize respect, to tell him what he wants to hear, but Trump himself is seeking concrete success, especially on the Israeli-Iranian track, where he believes he is close to achieving his goals. He is making efforts to show the world his determination and confirm that his statements are not empty words. Peace through strength is precisely the principle that is being implemented by Israeli hands today. As Merz pointed out, Israel does all the dirty work for the Allies. It would be appropriate if he also added that Ukraine performs a similar function in matters of European security. Without it, Europe's security system is effectively nullified, as both NATO and the United Nations have demonstrated their inability to respond effectively to challenges. Recently, a sociological survey was conducted in Poland, the country closest to the epicenter of the conflict and the most active in defense issues. Its results are telling. 55% of citizens do not believe that the United States and NATO will come to Poland's aid in the event of possible aggression by Russia. This says a lot about the current situation. Most people in Europe are convinced that the security of the continent depends directly on developments in the Russian-Ukrainian direction. This opinion is shared not only by citizens, but also by political elites, which is a positive signal for you. Their support will continue, especially against the background of Russia's weakening after the events in Syria and around Iran. As for the US, it will stick to its foreign policy agenda, and after the Middle East phase, including the achievements of the Abrahamic Agreement, Trump will inevitably return to the Ukrainian front. Without progress on this issue, it will be difficult for him to succeed with China, Russia, or the European Union. He needs a result here to strengthen his own position. Therefore, it is unlikely that the Israeli-Iranian war will drag on. It is likely to end in the foreseeable future, with benefits for the US and Israel and extremely grave consequences for the current regime in Tehran.
Она в ближайшее время должна закончиться, и она закончится с успехом для США и Израиля, и она очень плохо закончится для нынешнего режима в Тегеране.
Yunus would like to ask you about the upcoming G7 and NATO summit scheduled for June 24 to 25. The Financial Times reports that Trump allegedly left the G7 summit early because of disagreements with Macron and his unwillingness to meet with Zelensky because he is not interested in him. In your opinion, should Ukraine continue to cooperate with the United States, at least in terms of military purchases? Or, on the contrary, should it abandon direct contact and hand over the initiative to its European partners?
пытаться купить военный пакет, который очень нужно, который уже есть в списках Владимира Зеленского, и есть деньги, которые нам дают партнеры. Что дальше делать? Вообще пытаться не контактировать Зеленскому с Трампом или уже делегировать европейцам?
You read the Financial Times, the New York Times, the Washington Post, Bloomberg, and others like them. I call them the yellow press because, despite their former reputation as serious publications, they are now wishful thinking. I was listening to Donald Trump in person today, and he was asked a pertinent question at the White House just a couple hours ago. The question was about Macron, and Trump spoke quite favorably of him. He simply noted that Macron had phrased one thought poorly, and he corrected him by suggesting he phrased it differently. Trump's departure from the summit was also due to a completely different reason, which he also reported. It concerns the situation around the conflict between Israel and Iran.
Совершенно. Уезжал он оттуда, и опять же он ответил, он уехал совершенно по другой причине, я вам ее расшифровал. Это касается Израиля и иранской войны.
This also applies to the meeting with President Zelensky. As you saw, even in more unfavorable circumstances, he still met with him. In this case, he did not meet not only with Zelensky, but with a number of other leaders. He actually violated the planned agenda of Canadian Prime Minister Carney. I think they will still meet at the NATO summit in the near future, where they will discuss all the necessary public issues. At the same time, it is worth remembering, as Plato said, there is form and there is content. Nowadays, special attention is paid to the form, and there is little content in the agendas of the G7 and NATO summits. Already today, we can say that we should not expect cardinal or revolutionary decisions from the upcoming NATO summit.
Содержания как такового мало, будь то на G7, будь то на предстоящем НАТО. Я могу сегодня вам даже сказать, что кардинальных, так сказать, революционных решений на саммите НАТО не ожидайте.
Today it is becoming obvious that NATO is experiencing a serious political crisis caused by its inability to respond adequately to Russia's aggression against Ukraine and to protect its ally, which is located directly in Europe and actually ensures its security. NATO's actions in this situation are far from the level the alliance is capable of. NATO is most often understood primarily as two countries, the United States and Turkey, which have the most capable armies. The United Kingdom and France can be added to them because of the presence of nuclear weapons, but the key military forces remain the United States and Turkey. If we talk about the European part of the alliance, there are practically no other armies of comparable size after the Turkish army, which numbers over 1 million.
После этого можно к ним добавить и Великобританию с Францией, потому что у них есть ядерное оружие. Но США и Турцию я имею в виду как две боеспособные армии. Вот. И если мы говорим о Европе, то сегодня после турецкой армии по масштабам, то есть турецкая более миллиона,
The Ukrainian army today is approaching the level of the most combat-ready forces,
and the
Turkish army has been active in military operations throughout NATO's history,
as have U.S.
as well as American troops. An army must fight and gain obliged to have combat experience. Ukrainian forces and the Ukrainian army is demonstrating to a rather powerful adversary, Russia. Regardless of views on Russia, its military remains one of the largest armies in terms of numbers. It may lag behind technologically inferior to Western countries, but it remains a significant military force. And yet Ukraine is holding this onslaught quite confidently. It is hard to find an army in Europe that could demonstrate something similar without nuclear weapons. Neither France nor the UK will reach the same level without their nuclear capabilities. Understanding this sets the agenda for discussion, something that is regularly talked about at conferences I attend and where my colleagues and friends participate.
И поэтому, понимая это все, я так думаю, именно об этом и будут говорить. Об этом, в принципе, говорят регулярно, вот на этих конференциях, на которых я бываю, на которых сегодня бывают мои друзья.
I have no doubt that the NATO summit will be held in this manner, and no cardinal decisions will be made, since it is impossible to reformat the alliance without the leading role of the United States. Donald Trump seems to be moving in this direction. He seeks to zero in on relations with the entire world, with allies and opponents alike, on a commercial basis, like a businessman. This includes China, Canada, Russia, the European Union, and NATO itself. His logic is simple: 2%, then 5%. Increase defense spending, buy American weapons, and thereby ensure your own security. In that case, you will not need an American umbrella, and there is no point in expecting protection for free. He states bluntly, if you want me to defend you, you have to pay. He is ready to send American soldiers to supply appropriate weapons, including on a rental basis. But for free, as it has been for 70-80 years, it will not happen again. He talks about it openly, talks about duties with different countries come from the same logic. Sometimes he voices exaggerated demands, such as China, but then backs off to apply pressure and start negotiations from scratch. Where is this leading to? Eventually, there will be a zeroing out of relations with NATO, the European Union, and other allies. And in such a new security architecture, it must be clearly understood. Without Ukraine, Europe's security system is simply impossible. It can exist even without the US participation to the same extent as before, but not without Ukraine. At another level, such a system is possible because the US could zero in on the current situation and move to support Europe on a commercial basis, on a scale that would be beneficial to Washington. Europeans awakening after a long strategic pause under the leadership of Germany, Great Britain, and other countries will begin to develop the military-industrial complex, invest in defense, and eventually work out a new agreement on the continent's security. Ukraine will certainly occupy a special place in this system. What it will be called, new NATO or otherwise, is not so fundamental. Therefore, talk about inviting Ukraine to NATO should be postponed today. Everything about the past is in the past. Yes, it was a mistake to write it into the Constitution at that time. When you did that, you didn't even fully realize how realistic it was. Those who claimed that NATO was something flawless didn't have the full picture either, because they hadn't faced a full-scale war. I believe that NATO has fulfilled its historical mission. It was created to confront the Soviet Union and the United States. At that time, there were two blocks, NATO and the Warsaw Pact. Since the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact, NATO has remained without facing a truly strong adversary. Conflicts like Yugoslavia or Iraq involved asymmetric threats, unlike potential rivals, such as Russia or China. As a result, NATO lacks experience in full-scale war against an equal opponent. Although they have everything for this, the power that Ukraine has demonstrated today is a real force, a real army. If several such armies, hardened in war, become the backbone of the European security system, and if all this is supplemented by modernization, especially in the conditions of modern warfare, the accents in armament are radically shifting. There used to be talk of tanks like the Abrams, but now they are no longer so relevant. The availability of drones with artificial intelligence is coming to the fore. There is a real technological race going on today. and the one who can master this capability faster wins. It is not for nothing that Russia insists on creating a buffer zone, just like Ukraine. Imagine, 50 kilometers in or out, and the entire area is under the full control of autonomous drones that destroy any unnecessary movement. This will happen regularly, and such a system can indeed be created. The question is, who will do it first? Ukraine is seen to be moving rapidly in this direction. If such a system is realized, it will become the basis for a buffer zone and a controlled border. Modern warfare has evolved, demanding that NATO adapt both politically and militarily. The Russian-Ukrainian war has become a testing ground for these changes. Over 3 years, Ukraine has made significant progress, especially in technologies like drones. Meanwhile, Europe remains at peace. All of this together, in my opinion, will be the main leitmotif of the upcoming NATO summit. The realization that the United States is temporarily handing over the leadership role in European security issues to the Europeans themselves. While Washington will focus on China, Russia, the Middle East, Iran, and trade duties, finalizing the topic of the Iranian conflict and promoting the Abrahamic agreements will only strengthen the U.S. position. Donald Trump is likely to return to European issues, and both China and Russia will have to reckon with that. I look at the situation positively. What is happening in the Iran-Israel conflict is beneficial for Ukraine, as well as the changes in Syria, with the participation of Turkey and Israel. In this context, Ukraine's position expressing concern was timely and correct. In this situation, one cannot take a clear-cut position of support or condemnation, as this is not your war or the war of my native Azerbaijan. Nevertheless, Azerbaijan has expressed deep concern, as the conflict is unfolding at the very border, and there are about 30-40 million ethnic Azerbaijanis living there. In addition, there is a risk of an incident involving possible nuclear radiation that could reach our territory, as was the case with the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Therefore, we cannot remain indifferent to what is happening to our compatriots. We have asked Israel to take into account the dense concentration of ethnic Azerbaijanis in certain regions and not to strike these territories unless absolutely necessary. It is important that any military action be carried out with caution to avoid casualties among civilians, especially Azerbaijanis, as this is strategically important for relations between our countries. This is not our war. Therefore, like you, we expressed only deep concern. Everyone has their own conflict. You have a war, we had a war with Armenia, and this should be understood. One should not follow other people's narratives and agendas imposed by world powers. What is happening between Israel and Iran is actually a strategy of the United States designed for a long-term confrontation with China. After all, it was China and Russia that supported Iran, and now their influence is being squeezed out. It is no coincidence that Putin is in contact with Xi Jinping. They need to harmonize their position, what to do next after losing in Syria and weakening their influence elsewhere. Despite Donald Trump's polite statements, including to Russia, many are convinced that he is playing to his own agenda. Similar suspicions have been cast on Erdogan, when it has been claimed that he is acting in Moscow's interests, and all this at a time when Turkey is losing influence in Syria. There is clearly an agenda at work in this situation, as the same Netanyahu, who was previously described as a close ally of Putin, is now hitting back at the mullah's regime, allied with Russia in the Russia-Ukraine war. This seems like a paradox, but it is important not to listen to rhetoric, but to look at real actions, which is what Ukraine should be coming from. President Zelensky's statement can also be interpreted in a similar way. Speaking about Donald Trump, he actually expressed hope that he will end the war, not by 2029, but much earlier, and will re-engage in the European agenda, helping NATO, the European Union, and the European security system. Ukraine is ready to say whatever it needs to say, as long as Trump does not distance himself and does not provide an excuse for speculation on the part of his enemies. That is how I perceive this statement by Zelenskyy. Yunus, thank you so much for this conversation. Thank you for taking the time every week on Thursday nights to analyze the events of the week. In these 30-40 minutes, you have commented on everything that is happening in the world. Thank you very much. Thank you. Goodbye. Glory to Ukraine. Glory to the heroes. Just to remind our viewers, we have with us a politician from the United States of America, Ramiz Yunus. Give us a like, write your questions, because every week we are here to talk about the main events. Don't forget to click the bell to be notified when we have new airings with Ramiz Yunus, and share our conversation. That's how YouTube's algorithms work. The more shares, the more people will see our interviews. My name is Ihor Havryshchak. See you on the air.
Мене звати Ігор Гаврищак, побачимось в ефірі.